The email notification lit up Daniel Crawford's phone at 6:18 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and the subject line made his coffee go cold in his hand. Notice of HOA compliance violation. Immediate action required. Daniel, a 42-year-old forestry consultant who'd inherited his grandfather's lakefront property 3 years ago, stared at the screen in disbelief. A compliance violation? He'd maintained the property meticulously, paid every fee on time, and stayed out of HOA politics entirely. But when he scrolled down to see the attached photo, his jaw clenched. There, stretching across his private shoreline like a wooden snake, was a brand new boardwalk he'd never authorized. The HOA hadn't just encroached on his property. They built an entire recreational structure using his timber rights without permission, consultation, or compensation. For 6 months, he'd watched the HOA president, Margaret Steinberg, grow increasingly aggressive about improving lake access for all residents. But this crossed every line. As Daniel grabbed his property deed and headed for the door, one thought burned through his mind. Margaret had no idea who she just declared war on. And what she definitely didn't know was that Daniel didn't just own the land. He owned something far more valuable. Where are you from? Tell us in the comments below. And if you're loving this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Now, let's see exactly how this unfolded. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that turned the patient man into an unmovable force. The confrontation where decades of legal expertise met entitled ignorance. And the resolution where timber rights became the most expensive lesson an HOA ever learned. In the first part, we'll witness Daniel's journey from peaceful property owner to someone who'd been pushed beyond every reasonable boundary. For half a year, he endured escalating demands and dismissive treatment, watching helplessly as the HOA chipped away at his rights. He tried every peaceful solution, followed every proper channel, and extended every courtesy. The toll it took wasn't just financial or legal. It was personal, rooted in family legacy and the memory of a grandfather who taught him that some ground you simply don't surrender. The breaking point wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, cold, and absolutely final. The moment Daniel saw that boardwalk, something shifted. The negotiation phase was over. In the second part, the power dynamic will flip completely. Daniel won't just confront Margaret and her HOA board. He'll systematically dismantle every assumption they've made about him, reveal documentation they never knew existed, and present them with legal realities that turn their recreational project into a financial nightmare. The confrontation won't happen in anger. It will happen in a conference room with lawyers present, where Daniel's calm professionalism will be far more terrifying than any raised voice. Watch as the HOA's confidence crumbles when they realize they've built their boardwalk on land they don't control, using resources they don't own, with permission they never had the authority to grant themselves. In the third part, justice arrives with the precision of a forestry harvest plan. The boardwalk will come down, but not before the HOA learns exactly how much their arrogance cost them. There will be twists they never anticipated, consequences that ripple through their organization, and a final reckoning that transforms Daniel from the quiet guy by the lake into the property owner who reminded an entire community what property rights actually mean. The resolution won't just be satisfying. It'll be educational. Here's exactly how it happened. Daniel Crawford had never intended to become a property owner in Pinewood Lake Estates. His grandfather, Thomas Crawford, had purchased the 5-acre lakefront parcel back in 1967, when the area was still undeveloped wilderness and land sold for prices that would seem laughable today. Thomas had been a timber broker, and he'd structured the purchase with the foresight of someone who understood that land and timber were 2 separate assets. When the property passed to Daniel after Thomas died in 2021, Daniel inherited not just the land and the modest cabin his grandfather had built, but something far more valuable, perpetual timber rights to an additional 40-acre tract that surrounded the development. It was an old-style deed, the kind they didn't write anymore, and it gave Daniel harvesting authority over every tree on that 40 acres regardless of who owned the surface land. The HOA, formed in 1995 when the development was built, had never bothered to research the original property structure. They assumed, like most people would, that they controlled everything within their boundaries. Daniel had moved into the cabin full-time after a divorce left him wanting solitude and a career that allowed remote work. As a forestry consultant, he could manage timber assessments and harvest plans from anywhere with internet access. The lakefront property was perfect. Quiet, private, and surrounded by the woods his grandfather had loved. For the first 2 years, Daniel had minimal interaction with the HOA. He paid his annual fees, kept his property maintained, and attended exactly 0 board meetings. That changed when Margaret Steinberg was elected HOA president in January of that year. Margaret was a 56-year-old retired real estate attorney who moved to Pinewood Lake Estates specifically to be a big fish in a small pond. Within weeks of taking office, she'd initiated 3 new improvement projects without proper resident votes and begun issuing compliance violations for infractions she'd invented herself. Daniel first appeared on her radar in March when she sent him a letter demanding he trim trees along the shoreline to improve sight lines for community enjoyment of the lake. Daniel had politely declined, explaining that the trees were on his private property and served as a windbreak for his dock. Margaret's response came 2 days later, a threat of daily fines. If he didn't comply within 30 days, Daniel had handled it calmly. He pulled his property survey, highlighted his boundary lines, and sent Margaret a certified letter explaining that HOA authority ended at the property line and she had no jurisdiction over his landscaping choices. The fines never materialized, but Margaret's resentment did. At the April board meeting, which Daniel attended specifically to address the issue, Margaret had made a comment that stuck with him. Some people think being grandfathered means they're above community standards. The other board members had shifted uncomfortably, but no one challenged her. The real problems began in May when Margaret announced her signature project, a community boardwalk that would provide lake access to residents whose properties didn't have direct shoreline. It was a reasonable idea in theory, except Margaret's proposed route cut directly across Daniel's property. When Daniel received the construction notice in late May, he immediately contacted Margaret and requested a meeting. She'd made him wait 3 weeks for a 15-minute phone call where she explained that the boardwalk was for the community good and that Daniel should be a team player. When Daniel pointed out that the route crossed his private land without an easement or his permission, Margaret's tone had shifted to ice. "We've consulted with our attorney," she'd said. "The HOA has recreational access rights under the master deed. Construction begins June 15th. Daniel had spent that night reading every page of the master deed, the HOA bylaws, and his own property documents. The recreational access clause Margaret referenced applied only to common areas and explicitly required written permission for any construction on private lots. Margaret was either incompetent or banking on Daniel not fighting back. He'd send her a formal cease and desist letter on June 1st, copied to every board member, with citations to the relevant deed sections and a clear warning that any construction on his property would constitute trespassing and property damage. Margaret's response had arrived on June 10th. A single sentence stating that the HOA board had voted to proceed with construction in accordance with their legal authority, and that Daniel's concerns had been noted and overruled. Daniel had felt something cold settle in his chest when he read those words. They weren't just dismissing him. They were daring him to stop them. Construction began on June 16th, a day after Daniel had been called away to Seattle for a week-long consulting job he couldn't postpone. When he returned on June 23rd, the boardwalk was 70% complete. It stretched 30 feet across his shoreline, supported by pressure-treated posts driven directly into his private beach, with decorative railings and built-in benches. Daniel had stood there in the evening light, watching HOA residents he'd never met strolling across his property like it was a public park, and felt something in him harden past the point of negotiation. He tried one more time to resolve it peacefully. On June 25th, Daniel had attended an emergency board meeting and presented his case with documentation, survey maps, and deed citations. Margaret had let him speak for exactly 4 minutes before cutting him off. "Mr. Crawford, your grandfather may have owned this land, but he's gone now. This is a community, and communities require cooperation. The boardwalk stays." 2 board members had nodded agreement. The other 3 had avoided eye contact. Daniel had walked out without another word. His next call had been to the county sheriff's office. The responding deputy had been sympathetic but clear. This was a civil property dispute, not a criminal matter, and Daniel would need to pursue it through the courts. When Daniel contacted his attorney, the response had been equally frustrating. A property lawsuit could take 18 months and cost $40,000 in legal fees, with no guarantee of success if the HOA's attorney could create enough ambiguity around the access rights language. Daniel had sat in his grandfather's cabin that night, looking at the framed photo of Thomas standing beside a massive oak tree he'd harvested in 1982, and made his decision. Margaret wanted to play property rights games? Fine, but she'd made one catastrophic miscalculation. She built her boardwalk using lumber, and Daniel owned the timber rights to every tree that lumber could have come from. He spent the next 2 weeks doing what he did best, research. Daniel pulled the original timber rights deed from 1967, had it verified by 3 separate real estate attorneys, and confirmed what he already knew. His grandfather's timber deed gave Daniel harvesting authority over the entire 40-acre tract that now comprised Pinewood Lake Estates. With one exception, individual residential lots were excluded once homes were built. But common areas, recreational spaces, and any structures built with timber sourced from that tract, those fell squarely under Daniel's authority. The boardwalk wasn't just built on his land. It was built with materials that legally required his consent to harvest. On July 9th, Daniel sent Margaret and the HOA board a registered letter. It contained 23 pages of documentation, 3 legal opinions, and one very clear ultimatum. The boardwalk had 14 days to be completely removed, or Daniel would exercise his timber rights to remove it himself and bill the HOA for every associated cost. Margaret's response came via her attorney 2 days later, a letter calling Daniel's claim frivolous and legally baseless, threatening him with harassment charges if he continued, and stating unequivocally that the boardwalk was permanent HOA infrastructure. Daniel smiled when he read that letter, because Margaret had just put everything in writing. And on July 24th, everything was finally ready. The HOA board meeting on July 24th started at 7 p.m. in the community center, and Daniel arrived at 6:45 with a leather portfolio and an expression that made the security volunteers step back involuntarily. Margaret was already seated at the head table, flanked by board members Patricia Hodges, Robert Chun, and 2 others whose names Daniel had memorized from the property records. When Daniel walked to the front and placed his portfolio on the table in front of Margaret, the room went silent. "Good evening, Margaret," Daniel said calmly. "I'm here to give you one final opportunity to address the boardwalk situation before I take the action I document in this portfolio." His voice was steady, professional, and absolutely devoid of emotion. Margaret barely glanced at the portfolio before pushing it back toward him. "Mr. Crawford, we've been over this. The boardwalk is community property built on community land under community authority. Your repeated harassment of this board is becoming actionable. I suggest you leave before I call the sheriff." Daniel didn't move. Instead, he opened the portfolio and removed the first document. This is the original timber deed from 1967, signed by the previous property owner and my grandfather, Thomas Crawford. It grants perpetual timber harvesting rights to 40 acres that now comprise this development. He placed it in front of Margaret. This second document is a legal opinion from Morrison & Gray, the largest real estate firm in the state. confirming that those timber rights supersede any subsequent HOA agreements and apply to any structures built using timber from the designated tract. Margaret's expression flickered, but she recovered quickly. That's absurd. We didn't use timber from any specific tract. The lumber was purchased from a commercial supplier. Daniel nodded. Cascade Timber Supply, order number 4472024, placed on June 3rd. I have the invoice. He placed another document on the table. Cascade sources 90% of their pressure-treated lumber from Whitman Mills. Whitman Mills has a long-term harvesting contract for this exact 40-acre tract, granted by my grandfather in 1995 and renewed with me in 2022. Your Boardwalk is built with lumber that legally required my consent to harvest. The room was now completely silent. Patricia Hodges leaned forward to read the documents, her face draining of color. Robert Chun had stopped pretending to check his phone. Daniel continued in the same level tone. But even if we set aside the timber rights issue, there's a more fundamental problem. The boardwalk crosses 30 feet of my private property without an easement, without my permission, and without any legal authority. You've committed willful trespassing and property damage. Margaret's face had gone rigid. Our attorney reviewed the master deed. We have recreational access rights. Daniel removed another document. This is the master deed with the recreational access clause highlighted. It applies exclusively to designated common areas and requires written permission from any private property owner for construction. You have no such permission from me. Your attorney either didn't read the full document or advised you incorrectly. We had a board vote, Margaret said, but her voice had lost its certainty. The board doesn't have authority to override private property rights, Daniel replied. That's not how property law works. But I'm not here to debate legal theory. I'm here to offer you a choice. He placed one final document on the table. This is a formal notice of timber rights enforcement and property restoration. You have 72 hours to completely remove the boardwalk, restore my shoreline to its original condition, and provide written confirmation that the HOA will not attempt any future construction on my property. If you comply, we're done. If you don't, I will exercise my timber rights to remove the structure myself, bill the HOA for all associated costs, including legal fees and property restoration, and file a formal lawsuit for trespassing and property damage. Margaret stared at the document like it was a snake. You can't just tear down community infrastructure. Daniel's expression didn't change. I absolutely can. And if you force me to do it through legal enforcement, I'll also seek damages for every day the structure has occupied my property since construction began. That's 38 days at commercial rental rates for waterfront property. Would you like to know what that calculates to? Patricia Hodges spoke for the first time, her voice shaking slightly. How much are we talking about? Daniel had done the math weeks ago. For the removal and restoration, approximately $45,000 plus my legal fees. For the rental damages if we go to court, another $60,000. And that's before we discuss the timber rights violation, which carries statutory penalties. He let that sink in for 3 seconds. Or you can remove it voluntarily in the next 72 hours, and this ends here. Robert Chun cleared his throat. Margaret, we need to consult with our attorney immediately. Margaret's hands were shaking now, barely visible against the table. This is extortion, she said, but the words came out weak. Daniel shook his head slowly. This is property rights enforcement. You built on my land without permission using materials you had no authority to harvest. Every day you've known about this issue and refused to address it constitutes willful trespass. I've given you multiple opportunities to resolve this peacefully. You've declined every one. He closed his portfolio and picked it up. You have until 5 p.m. on July 27th. After that, I'll have a professional demolition crew on site at 8 a.m. on July 28th, and you'll receive the bill 30 days later. The choice is entirely yours. Daniel turned and walked toward the exit. Behind him, He heard Patricia hissing at Margaret in a furious whisper and Robert already dialing someone on his phone. Daniel didn't look back. The meeting had gone exactly as he planned out at 4:47 p.m. on July 27th. Daniel received an email from the HOA's attorney. The boardwalk removal will begin the following morning, conducted by the same contractor who built it, at the HOA's expense. All work would be completed within 5 business days. The email included a formal apology for the misunderstanding regarding property boundaries and an acknowledgement that the HOA had proceeded without proper authorization. Daniel printed the email and filed it with his other documentation. He didn't respond. The demolition began at 7:15 a.m. on July 28th. Daniel watched from his deck as a crew of 4 workers systematically dismantled the boardwalk, pulling posts from his beach and loading the lumber onto a flatbed truck. Margaret was conspicuously absent, but Patricia Hodges stood at the property line for most of the morning, her expression unreadable. By noon, half the structure was gone. By the end of the second day, nothing remained but disturbed sand and a few post holes. But Daniel's victory wasn't complete yet, and he planned for the possibility that the HOA might try to cut corners. On the third day, when the crew attempted to leave the beach restored, with the post holes poorly filled and drainage patterns disrupted, Daniel documented everything with photographs and called the contractor directly. The restoration standard is original condition, not roughly filled in, he said calmly. If I have to hire my own crew to fix this properly, I'll bill the HOA for those costs as well. Your choice. The crew returned the next day with proper fill sand and a landscape rake. They spent 6 hours regrading the beach, matching the original contours and restoring the natural drainage. Daniel inspected the work personally and approved it at 4:30 p.m. The contractor looked relieved to be done. The real twist came on August 2nd, when Daniel received a call from Robert Chun. Daniel, I want to apologize personally for how this situation was handled, Robert said, his voice careful. Several board members weren't fully informed about the property issues before the vote. We've since reviewed all the documentation you provided, and you were right about everything. Daniel waited. Robert continued. Margaret has resigned as HOA president, effective immediately. Patricia is taking over temporarily. We're also implementing new protocols requiring property surveys and legal review before any future construction projects. Daniel kept his voice neutral. I appreciate you telling me. There was a pause. There's something else, Robert said. We discovered that Margaret approved the boardwalk expenditure without a proper budget vote. The actual cost was $68,000, which exceeded her authorization limit by $43,000. She essentially committed financial fraud against the HOA. We're pursuing legal action to recover the funds. Daniel processed that information in silence. Margaret hadn't just been arrogant. She'd been reckless with other people's money. That's between the HOA and Margaret, he said finally. I'm done with this situation as long as my property rights are respected going forward. Robert let out a breath. They will be. You have my word. And for what it's worth, you taught us all an expensive lesson about doing proper due diligence. The final piece fell into place 3 weeks later when Daniel saw Margaret's property listed for sale. She was leaving Pinewood Lake Estates entirely. And according to the neighborhood gossip that Patricia shared during a surprisingly cordial conversation, Margaret's legal bills from the HOA lawsuit and her own attorney fees had exceeded $90,000. She thought she could bully her way through because she used to be a real estate attorney, Patricia said, shaking her head. But she'd been out of practice for 15 years and never specialized in property rights. She didn't know what she didn't know, and she picked the wrong person to underestimate. Daniel didn't take pleasure in Margaret's financial ruin, but he didn't regret defending his rights either. The boardwalk incident had cost the HOA approximately $120,000 in construction, removal, legal fees, and settlement costs. It had cost Margaret her position, her reputation, and a substantial portion of her retirement savings. and it had cost Daniel exactly $0 beyond his time. Because the HOA had wisely chosen not to force a court battle, they would have lost catastrophically. 2 months after the boardwalk came down, Daniel sat on his grandfather's old dock at sunset with a bottle of local beer and a feeling of profound peace. His beach was restored, his property rights were documented and respected, and the HOA had learned that grandfathered in didn't mean irrelevant. It meant protected by legal precedent older than your entire development. Daniel had learned something too. His grandfather had always told him that the most valuable property right wasn't the surface land. It was the resources underneath and the legal framework protecting them. Thomas Crawford had structured that timber deed in 1967 with the foresight of someone who understood that future developments might try to claim authority they didn't have. He built in protection that outlasted his own lifetime, and it had saved Daniel from having his property permanently violated by people who thought community votes could override private. Deeds died as the sun dropped below the tree line and painted the lake orange and gold. Daniel raised his beer in a silent toast to his grandfather. Sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from 60-year-old legal documents and the patience to let entitled people hang themselves with their own arrogance. And as Daniel sat there in complete peace on shoreline that was unquestionably, legally, and permanently his, he smiled. Because justice, whether delivered through timber rights or property law, was equally satisfying. Across the country in Boulder, Colorado, retired civil engineer Maria Santos was reviewing her property survey when her HOA sent her a violation notice for her rainwater collection system. Maria smiled and pulled out the water rights certification she'd obtained before installation, along with the state engineer's approval and the municipal variance she personally helped draft. "Please," she said quietly to the empty office, "try to tell a water rights engineer what she can and cannot do with drainage on her own property." She began drafting her response, which would include 17 pages of hydrological analysis and case law. The HOA president, who'd been in office for exactly 6 weeks, had no idea what was coming. But that's a story for another time.